Thank you very much. Paula Speevak is with us. Paula, please.
Okay, merci et bonjour. Et comme
Thank you and good afternoon. As was said, I'm with Volunteer Canada.
volunteering and starting with some trends in volunteering, following up on what Professor Handy has already shared. So first of all, I'm going to start with a story because it relates to some of the questions earlier, which is what constitutes a meaningful volunteer opportunity, and particularly for youth. In a focus group, when we were researching youth engagement, a youth shared with us that he had seen somebody finding food in a garbage can on his way shopping one day, and he became very concerned about the fact that people did not have food. And he found out that there was a meal program at a local community center and wanted to volunteer there. And so he offered himself. And he was put in a room beside the kitchen for 2 hours and asked to fold tea towels in a certain way where the floral pattern was outside. And after about 2 hours of this, and somebody came in once in a while and took some out of the pile because they weren't folded exactly the way they should be, and he came out after 2 hours, and all the guests from the meal program had already gone and they were cleaning up, and he just felt so disheartened. And I offer this example because very often there is ageism involved in youth engagement. While people think of things for youth to do, they have no idea the great energy, insight, and compassion that all of us have regardless of our age. So I'll start with just a little bit about Volunteer Canada. Some of you may know us that we provide national leadership and expertise on volunteering, and it's in order to enhance participation, quality, and diversity of volunteering. And so that relates to some of the things we've been discussing. And we don't do this alone. We work with 220 local volunteer centers around the country. You may know the Kentville Volunteer Center, the Community Sector Council of Newfoundland Labrador, Volunteer Victoria, and so on. We also work with the Corporate Council on Volunteering, which is a leadership group of businesses that encourage their employees to volunteer and actually create some of the resources to make sure we have a reciprocal relationship between what communities need and what businesses are looking for. We work with the Alliance for Community Service Learning and a number of government departments, including Statistics Canada, who we heard from before, Employment and Social Development Canada, Public Safety Canada around screening issues, and of course recently, as you heard, Canada Service Corps. And incidentally, around numbers, you were asking that in the month of May, there were 12,000 visitors to the Canada Service Corps button that leads to looking for volunteer opportunities. So it's really picking up. I know you also heard from Statistics Canada about an overview of volunteering in Canada, but I did want to highlight a couple of things. One is that, as you know, in 2010, 44% of Canadians over 15 volunteered. And when I was in my office, because I was on the steering committee with the folks from Statistics Canada, waiting for the advanced statistics for the 2013, I was definitely expecting it to be over 50%. And of course, it came back 44%, and I just couldn't believe it, because my sense was that so many people are doing great things. As many of you have discussed in previous sessions, there's a lot changing. And so I was very concerned, but also curious. Is this a blip? Is it something to be concerned about? So a couple of things I would say. The first thing is that we looked at, is this a question of demographics? If the population's aging and older people have a somewhat lower volunteer rate, maybe that could explain it. Is it possibly all the caregiving responsibilities many people find? Or is it simply a matter of people are volunteering in different ways that is not being captured? So I know that Professor Handy already mentioned that many statistics only can't capture formal volunteering. With respect to youth, I did want to point out that everyone is quick to say that the high volunteer rate among youth, which is exceptional, is because they have to due to mandatory community service. But 80% of youth volunteer because they want to. It is separate from. The other thing to note is that the average is 110 hours every year, not just the 40 hours you need to do over 4 years. And I think it's important that we recognize that and we don't belittle the great compassion that's happening. So enough of my editorializing on youth engagement. A few years ago, we were concerned about the gap between what people were looking for in volunteering and how organizations were organizing volunteer opportunities. So we came up with 5 gaps. So the first one is that many people are looking for group volunteering activities. We're sociable beings, but very few organizations are set up to engage people in groups. Many people have professional experience, and maybe some of them want to give that professional experience and skills, but many people say the last thing they want to do is do what they've done all day at work. The other gap is that organizations are expected, as you've heard, to be very well organized, clearly define the roles, and make that volunteer experience very effective. However, many people are saying, we want to come into an organization and kind of create our own opportunity. We know what you need, and that's very typical among many age groups because of our autonomous nature. Organizations are still looking for long-term commitments, and many people are looking for shorter term. And finally, the fact that organizations often focus on what they need from volunteers, whereas, as you've heard, many of us have personal goals when we volunteer. In addition to helping in the community, we may want to prevent being isolated. We may want to develop skills and so on. And so developing a culture where it's really a reciprocal relationship is really important. So that's on trends. The other thing is the expanding nature of volunteering. And again, Professor Handy touched on the idea of informal volunteering. But what we're finding around the world, many folks that are following the trends in volunteering are finding that formal volunteering is either plateauing or decreasing, and informal volunteering is actually increasing. And so I'm talking about things like if you want to raise funds for a neighbor whose child is disabled to renovate their van, you do many of the platforms. If you want to mobilize people to go and celebrate International Human Rights Day, you can do that outside of an organization. You just mobilize through social media. And so people are raising awareness, raising funds, organizing events, fundraising, and really making a difference outside of organizations. And I think it behooves us to say that this doesn't count. So I think there's a lot going on, and this is something we're seeing around the world. In terms of what we call volunteering, whether we call it citizen engagement, many people have said the word volunteering is a little outdated, but what we're feeling, at least at Volunteer Canada's lens, is that what we're best off rebranding and expanding people's notion of volunteering than trying to think of a new word every few years. But at the same time, we have to recognize language does matter. So when we think about corporate social responsibilities, and it refers to businesses' practices of hiring, of their purchasing, as well as donating and employees volunteering. Well, the same applies to individuals. So whether we call it individual social responsibility, and look at all the ways we express our values, from composting our banana peel to buying our coffee from a socially responsible coffee shop to carpooling, etc. Those are all decisions that we make throughout the day that directly impact on community and could connect to the way in which we want to make a difference. And again, all of that counts. In terms of the value of volunteering, I wanted to say that many people probably have come to you and said, oh, it's worth $56 billion, contribution of 2.5% to the gross domestic product in terms of what the nature of volunteering is worth, and I think that's true. On the other hand, I would say that the real value of volunteering is not in quantifying the hours and coming up with an economic value, but it's really in the impact. And I just wanted to take a few minutes to look at that. First of all, you look at volunteering and its impact on organizations. When you think about the value of a board member opening up doors or raising the profile, raising funds, having an impact on strategic direction of an organization, it's way beyond the number of hours they took to read the material and attend a board meeting. Similarly, if you look at the value to neighborhoods, we know that in neighborhoods where there's a high level of citizen engagement, the neighborhoods are more resilient and safer. So again, the value is beyond the number of hours or the number of burgers flipped at a barbecue, not to diminish that effort, because that is vitally important. Similarly, you heard that businesses find value in their employees volunteering in terms of morale and retention, team building, and so on. And society, when you think about all the great public policy changes that have been made, whether it's about impaired driving or wearing seatbelts, volunteers were at the heart of that, and so saving lives is something that has a greater impact than, again, the number of letters written to MPs and so on. So I would encourage us to think broader about the value of volunteering. And so finally, you asked us to reflect on how we can promote and facilitate volunteering. So the first thing is, as you heard from others, that a main barrier to volunteering is not knowing what the opportunities are. And so promoting and connecting people, local volunteer centres are doing that. And as you heard, we're working with Canada Service Corps on this pan-Canadian volunteer matching system. So that's one thing that I think can help. The second thing is expanding our definition of volunteering and really letting people know that they could do anything from, making costumes for a theater to counting tadpoles in a stream during certain hours and reporting it online. There's all kinds of really interesting things that people can do, and they can make up their own ideas. Skills-based volunteering is another thing that you may have heard about. It's the transfer of skills. Either I give my skills that I have, or I learn and develop skills through volunteering. Or a third way is that somebody with experience mentors me to offer my skills and develop my skills. But in any case, we need to make a better link between skills developed through volunteer experience and the paid workforce. So, for example, if I tell you that I have experience running a bake sale, you might not know what that necessarily involves. But if I told you that I did promotion, logistical planning, training shift workers to cover a 3-day event, purchasing the supplies and display, you might relate that to core competencies from the National Occupational Classification System and relate that to employment positions. And I think encouraging organizations to describe the volunteer opportunities in those ways and encouraging employers to see and recognize that volunteer experience, we can do a better job really helping with that alignment. Screening is an issue, as you may have heard, that there's 10 steps of screening, one of which involves vulnerable sector checks and police records checks. They're expensive, they take a lot of time, they're inconsistent around the country, and they're very important in certain cases. And we need to figure out a way to make it more consistent and accessible. And finally, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that when we look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and how much volunteers are already contributing to that, I think we can make a compelling and exciting argument to recruit more people. Who wouldn't want to volunteer to eliminate hunger, to promote clean water? And I think as global citizens, it excites us to think about being part of something broader. And when Canada reports on how we're doing with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, wouldn't it be great if we really understood the contributions of volunteers and understood how to promote? So with that, I will say thank you.
Speevak, thank you very much for a very detailed presentation. We're going to go to questions now. First to Senator Omnivar, please.
Thank you, Chair. I have so many questions for both of you, but in the interest of time, because we all want to get a question in, so I'm going to ask one question, and hopefully both of you can get a short answer to me. Canada does not have currently a national strategy for volunteerism. We have a youth strategy, which we heard of, but we do not have a national strategy. We did have one in 1999 with the Voluntary Sector Initiative and the launch of the in 2001. I'm forgetting the names, but I remember the timing. And then, of course, in 2006, it was all done away with. If we were to recreate a national volunteerism strategy, given the changes in trends that both of you have noted, what would it look like? What would the federal government role be?
Professor Handy, did you want to answer, or should I? Sure.
Please go first, Paula.
Sure. So one of the things that's great in terms of the provinces and territories is there are a number that do have some form of strategy. So Quebec has a great voluntary action strategy that they've developed over the last couple of years, and I think that's an excellent model. And in Quebec, they recognize what's called autonomous community action and entraide, mutual support, and it's really quite comprehensive. So that's one thing that I would say that hats off to Quebec for that, and a good model. What I think is important is a strategy that recognizes all forms of expression of values, and that helps people find opportunities, helps people leverage those opportunities, and provides an opportunity to reflect. I think that especially younger volunteers, it's one thing to have an experience, but it's really essential to have an opportunity to reflect on what you're learning about yourself, community, and your place in society.
Dr. Handy?
For me, I think that we have such a diverse country from coast to coast with people from all over the world. And I think that a lot of people get left out of the volunteering. So I think a federal strategy might be one that promotes opportunities for different people in different parts of the country to be able to volunteer. And that might be some strategy to help nonprofits reach out to diverse populations, ages, ethnicity, races, and have everyone work together so that we can have some kind of citizenship that people are very proud to be part of, to bring diverse people together. And the actual workings out will have to be thought out, but in some way to get nonprofits incentivized to have diversity in their volunteer pool, and rather than have only young people, only old people, or only females or males, to have diverse. There's too much noise. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So just to have a policy that promotes diversity in volunteering, both in the people who do it and the kinds of opportunities they get.
And Ms. Speevak, if you kindly help me figure out the answer that Stats Canada was not able to give me. Would you recommend that the satellite account on not-for-profits and volunteers be reinstated?
So my understanding is that the satellite account looked at calculating the contribution of the sector to the GDP from a point of view of what was employment, purchasing, and so on. And so it was very important. So I would agree that it's very important for us to have a sense as a sector of our contribution. Which included a calculation of the contributions of volunteer time. So I think that that is certainly important. I think that the information we're getting from the General Social Survey and giving volunteering and participating is probably more pertinent for organizations in terms of understanding patterns of volunteering, motivations, barriers, and so on. So both are important, but in terms of organizations and engaging volunteers, the General Social Survey and giving and volunteering is probably more pertinent. But for the sector at large, yes. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Duffy.
I want to thank both of our witnesses for their testimony today. I wonder what you think about the idea of creating a minister responsible for charities and volunteerism, a champion who could go across the country and synthesize with a small secretariat the issues, the barriers, the things that are impediments to the sector, and then become a champion for that sector, not only in cabinet, but across the country, travel the country and remind people of the importance of the sector and encourage people to get involved.
Do you want me to go?
Sure.
Okay. I think that really reaches the point of creating a bigger culture of volunteering, and to have a larger number of people aware of what's going on. I think that's a fabulous idea, but I also believe that we need data before we have we need evidence before you put policies in place or anything in place, because unless we have the data, and therefore I would the earlier question about getting data is very, very important as well.
Which particular data are you referring?
Both the general GSS as well as the national satellite accounts. We need that kind of data to understand what our policies are going to be, because we need to base our policy on evidence, and not that may sound good, but I also like the idea of having a commissioner or a minister of charities and volunteering. Maybe I'll run for the job. No, just kidding. Because I think unless we celebrate it, acknowledge it, and say it out loud, we're not going to get lots of people involved. And I think we need everyone to know of it and participate as a engaged community.
If it makes our report, we'll add your resume to it. Ms. Speevak.
I think it's a great idea to have a focal point and an individual who really is driven and identified with promoting volunteering and raising the profile of the sector. I also think that the caution I would suggest is that it needs to be done in collaboration with the sector, and I'm a fan of joint initiatives. So if there is a body that is made up of leaders in the sector as well as public officials and those responsible, I think that will have the most effective impact, because it will be understood to be authentic. And I think that will be very important.
Collaborative.
Look at the chart that StatScan gave us about the percentage rate of volunteering of the various age groups. It ranges from 66% from the youngest age group to 38% to the oldest in terms of hours of volunteering. Just in your professional experience, I mean, what do you consider to be, for a healthy society, what participation rates do you look for to know that a society is doing well? Like, what's the standard? Are these numbers good or not good, or what do you think?
So I think these numbers are great. In terms of when I compare to other places around the world, we're at least on par, and in most cases greater. I do want to say something controversial, though, is that you could make the argument that in a community where people have natural social ties, where generations live together, neighbors help one another, that there's not the same formal reliance on formal volunteering in organizations. So you could make the argument that in some cases a lower rate of volunteering actually reflects a closer community, and you do see that in certain places when you look at the data. So I would suggest that it's not more volunteering means healthier society. However, I think that when you're over 40% is certainly something that we could feel really good about.
Professor Handy?
Dr. Handy?
Yes, I think it really matters. Like, if you look in Europe, much of the volunteering that happens does not happen in the kind of nonprofits that we're used to. That happens more in sports associations and other kinds of associations. The idea is that if the government provides a lot of social services, nonprofits do not exist in a form that require food banks or health organizations or immigrant-based organizations, because a lot of it is already provided by the government. So I agree with Ms. Speevak that just having a large number of volunteers doesn't mean anything. It really matters what they do. In my own feeling is that having people engage with the other, just having those sort of bridging ties socially, just makes us healthier, because if something happens, we're much more resilient when we have the kind of bridging ties between one another than if we are just in our own little worlds doing our own little things. And so communities may be very healthy with those ties without going through formal volunteering, if you will. It matters what kinds of society. So this prefaces my earlier goals. What is your goals in promoting, having engaged people in society, whether it's through sports clubs or food banks, doesn't matter. You have people who believe in a public good.
Thank you.
Colleagues, thank you very much for the questions, and Ms. Speevak and Dr. Handy, thank you very much for your participation. It's been very informative. Again, as I try to tell all the witnesses, if you think of something that we forgot to ask or you forgot to say, don't hesitate in sending us something via the clerk, and he will distribute it to us. And I know that you're probably both paying attention to what we're doing, and if as we go along this process. We appreciate your input, and I'm sure that as we go through this, we'll be hearing from you again. Thank you again, and colleagues, we stand adjourned.